right, so we're back, and today we're diving into something that feels kind of like deja vu,
I was
right?
just thinking that.
A second Trump term, but this time it's 2025.
Yeah.
And he's back in the Oval Office.
Yeah.
And it's day one,
Damn.
January 20th.
Big day.
We've got some really interesting articles from Politico, actually a bunch of them,
Okay.
and a piece from the Washington Post
Right.
that really dive into what this could look like.
I'm intrigued.
You know, one of the things that jumps out at me just from like kind of scanning these is just how many day one promises he's making.
Oh, yeah, he's coming out swinging.
It's like he's trying to cram 4 years into 24 hours.
Well, I mean, that's kind of his style, isn't it? Go big or go home.
Totally.
But the question is how much of this is actually doable?
Right.
And what does it tell us about his priorities this time around?
Yeah, and it's not just the quantity.
Right.
It's the intensity.
Oh, for sure.
Like, there's this real theme of retribution this time.
Yeah.
Remember those campaign rallies?
Oh, yeah. How could you forget?
Like, the energy was so palpable.
Intense.
And now he's actually in a position to act on some of those threats.
Right.
And his list of perceived enemies is pretty extensive.
Well, it's a who's who of the Democratic Party, that's for sure.
Right.
I mean, you got Biden, Harris, Obama, Clinton, Pelosi, Jack Smith, Letitia James, the list goes on and on.
It's wild.
Yeah. But turning campaign rhetoric into actual presidential action is a whole other ballgame. I mean, the U.S. system with all its checks and balances, it's designed to prevent any one person, even the president, from just wielding absolute power like that.
Okay, so it's not like he can just snap his fingers and have people arrested.
Yeah.
But he does have a lot of influence.
Oh, absolutely.
He could use the bully pulpit to put pressure on certain agencies or individuals.
I mean, look at Nixon's enemies list. He didn't directly order illegal activities, but the climate of fear he created that definitely contributed to Watergate, right? So even if Trump doesn't act on all these threats, it creates this toxic atmosphere.
Totally. And let's be honest, he's never been shy about using pressure tactics.
Right.
So when he talks about appointing a special prosecutor to investigate the Bidens, or suggests that Nancy Pelosi should be prosecuted,
it's a little unnerving.
It's kind of scary.
For sure, the mere threat of legal action, even if nothing comes of it, can be a very powerful weapon.
Yeah.
I mean, it creates suspicion, damages reputations.
And especially in today's like hyper-partisan world.
Oh, absolutely. It just adds fuel to the fire.
But there have to be limits, right?
Well,
like going after someone like Letitia James, who investigated his business dealings.
Right.
That would be seen as just like blatant retaliation.
It would, and that's where the courts come in.
Right.
They're likely to push back against any actions that seem politically motivated or like an abuse of power.
Okay.
Remember, the Justice Department is supposed to operate independently.
Right.
It's not supposed to be influenced by the president.
So it's like this high-stakes game of chicken.
Yeah.
With the courts as the referee.
Potentially.
But even if he doesn't, like, fully unleash the dogs of war.
Right.
The fact that he's making these threats.
Oh, absolutely.
It just speaks volumes about his mindset going into this second term.
Yeah, it's not exactly a message of unity and healing, is it?
Right.
More like, I'm back and I'm coming for you.
Yeah.
Not exactly reassuring for a country that's already so divided.
Let's switch gears for a second and talk about something that's been a cornerstone of Trump's political identity from the beginning. Immigration.
Okay.
He has made a ton of day one pledges in this area, more than any other topic.
Oh, yeah, it's a big one for him.
And they are not subtle.
No.
Mass deportations, ending catch and release, terminating these so-called open border policies.
It's striking how much he's emphasizing executive action on immigration.
Right.
It's like he thinks he can just single-handedly overturn policies and implement sweeping changes.
On his own.
Without Congress, without anyone.
Yeah. It's a very I alone can fix it kind of vibe.
Well, he definitely tried that in his first term, right?
He did.
With the travel ban and the family separation policy.
Right.
Which, you know, sparked huge legal battles and public outcry.
Oh, absolutely. It was incredibly controversial.
So can he really just ignore due process and violate people's rights this time around?
Well, he can certainly try.
Right.
But the courts have already shown they're willing to push back on some of his immigration policies.
Right.
And then there are logistical challenges too, right?
Yeah.
Like mass deportations, for example.
That would require an enormous amount of resources, manpower, coordination.
Exactly. It's simply not feasible on day one, even if it were legal, which is a whole other debate.
Okay, let's break down some of these buzzwords because I think they get thrown around a lot, but For people who aren't immersed in these immigration policy debates, it can be confusing.
Right.
So what exactly does catch and release mean? Okay, so catch and release refers to the practice of releasing migrants into the U.S. while they await their immigration court hearings.
Okay.
Trump frames it as this loophole that allows undocumented immigrants to just disappear.
Right.
But it's actually a long-standing practice based on the idea that people shouldn't be indefinitely detained without a trial.
Makes sense.
It's about due process.
Okay, what about remain in Mexico?
So that was a Trump-era policy that forced asylum seekers to wait in Mexico while their cases were being processed in the U.S.
Wow.
Highly controversial because it exposed vulnerable people to dangerous conditions.
Right.
Limited their access to legal representation.
Wow, so these are complex issues with real human consequences.
Absolutely.
And it seems like his day one promises on immigration are more about like projecting strength and appealing to his base than offering like
workable solutions.
Yeah.
He's painting this picture of a country under siege
Right.
and himself as the only one who can save it.
the safe.
But the reality of immigration is much more nuanced than his rhetoric suggests.
So while his day one immigration agenda might grab headlines,
It will.
it's likely to face significant legal and logistical hurdles.
Oh, absolutely.
It'll be interesting to see how those play out.
Yeah, it's going to be a bumpy ride for sure.
But before we get ahead of ourselves,
Right.
we need to know who's going to be helping him implement this agenda.
Good point.
Who are the key players in his transition team and his potential cabinet?
Well, it looks like he's trying to strike a balance between loyalty and competence this time around.
Okay.
You've got some familiar faces from his first term, like Susie Wiles, who's being considered for chief of staff,
Right.
and Brian Hook, who might be tapped for the State Department.
Okay.
So those are some familiar faces.
But there are also some new names,
There are some intriguing new names, yeah.
like Robert Lighthizer,
Oh, yeah, his former trade representative.
who could play a major role on economic policy.
Right, and given Trump's love of tariffs, that's not exactly comforting news for free trade advocates.
Right.
That's for sure.
And then there are these rumors swirling around Elon Musk.
Elon Musk, really?
Yeah, some are speculating that he might be offered a position in a newly created
Oh, wow.
Department of Government Efficiency focused on slashing budgets.
Wow, that would be a wild card.
Talk about shaking things up.
I can't imagine him fitting into a traditional government role.
But maybe that's exactly what Trump wants, someone who's going to disrupt the status quo.
It's a high-risk, high-reward strategy, that's for sure.
It is.
I mean, on the one hand, having people who aren't afraid to challenge conventional wisdom could lead to some innovative solutions.
Right.
But on the other hand, it could also lead to reckless decision-making and a complete disregard for established processes.
And let's not forget, this transition team is already facing criticism
It is.
for potential conflicts of interest and a lack of transparency.
Yeah, there are already some rumblings of discontent.
Yes, some Trump allies are accusing them of pushing aside loyalists from the first term
Really?
in favor of these new faces who might be more beneficial, personally.
Huh. So much for loyalty.
It's a very dynamic situation,
It is very dynamic.
to say the least.
Yeah, for sure.
And it'll be fascinating to see how this team shapes Trump's agenda
Absolutely.
and navigates the inevitable challenges of a second term.
Right, because those challenges are definitely coming.
Yeah. But for now, let's move beyond the personalities
Okay.
and delve into the specific policy areas where Trump has promised day one action.
Let's do it.
Because there are a lot of them,
There are.
and they cover a lot of ground.
And they have the potential to really shake things up,
Absolutely.
for better or worse.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting ride.
It is. Buckle up.
We've talked about the people, the promises surrounding this potential second Trump term, but now let's get into the nitty-gritty of the possible consequences of those day one actions.
Okay.
And let's start with immigration, because that seems to be his, like, real hot-button issue.
Right. It's always been a central theme for him.
Yeah, and, I mean, the idea of mass deportations on the scale he's hinted at is...
It's alarming,
Yeah.
to say the least.
I mean, where would these people even go?
Right.
And has anyone considered the massive economic impact of removing so many people from the workforce?
Those are crucial questions, and they often get lost in the heated rhetoric around immigration.
Yeah.
I mean, mass deportations would be a logistical nightmare,
Yeah.
requiring immense resources and potentially leading to widespread human rights violations.
Right.
not to mention the economic fallout.
Yeah.
I mean, think about industries that rely heavily on immigrant labor, like agriculture, construction.
It's mind-boggling.
It really is.
Like,
yeah.
you'd think there would be more focus on the practicalities
Right.
of such a move, not to mention the ethical implications.
Absolutely.
We're talking about uprooting families, separating parents from children, sending people back to countries they may not even remember.
It's heartbreaking.
And I feel like his rhetoric on immigration often dehumanizes immigrants, portrays them as a threat
Yeah, it does.
rather than individuals with hopes and dreams.
It creates this us versus them mentality
Yeah.
that's incredibly dangerous.
It fuels xenophobia and fear.
Absolutely. It's a very slippery slope.
So mass deportations, not only impractical, but morally reprehensible.
I would agree with that assessment.
But what about some of his other promises on immigration, like ending catch and release
Yeah.
and reviving Remain in Mexico?
Okay, so those are certainly within the realm of presidential authority,
Okay.
but they would still face legal challenges.
Right.
Logistical hurdles.
Yeah.
Remember, the courts have already pushed back against some of his more extreme immigration policies in the past.
Right. Can you remind us what those policies entailed?
Sure. So ending catch and release would likely require a massive expansion of detention facilities,
Which are already...
overcrowded and notorious for their poor conditions.
Right.
And then Remain in Mexico. That forced asylum seekers to wait in dangerous conditions in Mexico while their cases were processed in the U.S.
Right.
Often with limited access to legal representation.
Yeah.
Human rights groups condemned it, and legal challenges eventually forced the Biden administration to rescind it.
So it seems like his approach to immigration is all about, like...
It's about creating a spectacle
Yeah.
of toughness.
Yeah.
Even if it means sacrificing basic human decency and practicality.
It's all about sending a message.
Yeah, even if that message is riddled with holes.
Right.
And I think it raises concerns about his governing style in general.
Yep.
I mean, if he's willing to disregard norms and the rule of law on immigration,
Right.
what's to stop him from doing the same on other issues?
Like climate change?
Climate change, education, you name it.
So let's talk about those.
Okay.
What are the potential consequences of his day one promises in these areas?
All right, well, on climate change, Trump has made it very clear he wants to undo a lot of the progress made under Biden.
Right.
We're talking about rolling back environmental regulations, promoting fossil fuels, potentially withdrawing from international agreements like the Paris Climate Accord.
It's like he's completely ignoring the science on climate change.
Yeah, it's a very short-sighted and dangerous approach.
Right.
And it puts the U.S. at odds with most of the world.
Which is increasingly taking action.
Exactly. The economic implications of ignoring this global shift could be massive.
Okay, what about education?
Okay, well, his threats to cut funding for schools that teach about race and gender or have mask mandates,
Yeah.
that's just a recipe for chaos and division.
And it seems like it would disproportionately impact marginalized students.
Oh, absolutely. It would widen the educational gap rather than close it.
And his attacks on transgender students are,
They're particularly concerning.
yeah, trying to ban gender-affirming care,
Right.
restrict their participation in sports.
It's discriminatory and deeply harmful.
So it seems like his day one agenda is just this greatest hits collection
Yeah, it's like a highlight reel.
of his most divisive and harmful policies.
It's a greatest hits of his base's favorite policies.
Right.
The ones that get the most applause at his rallies.
So what does this tell us about his overall approach to governing in a second term?
It suggests he's doubling down on the same strategies that defined his first term.
Okay.
Appealing to his base, stoking cultural anxieties, undermining democratic norms and institutions,
Consolidating power
silencing dissent.
rather than seeking common ground.
Exactly. It's about power, not unity.
And it seems like he's learned from his experience in the sense that he's focusing more on executive action,
Oh, absolutely.
trying to bypass Congress whenever possible.
He's not waiting for permission or consensus anymore.
He's just going for it.
He's learned that he can get away with a lot.
And that's a key observation
It is. It's a worrying trend
because he's clearly frustrated by the constraints of our system.
of checks and balances.
Yeah.
And that's a dangerous thing for any democracy.
The whole point of checks and balances is to prevent any one person or branch of government from having too much power.
Exactly.
If he succeeds in dismantling those safeguards.
It could have a lasting negative impact on American democracy.
It's unsettling to think about.
It is. It's a very real concern.
And he's not operating in a vacuum, right?
No, he's not.
You would have a Republican-controlled Congress.
Right, who are largely willing to go along with his agenda.
And he's already appointed a number of conservative judges.
To the federal courts, including the Supreme Court.
Who are likely to be sympathetic to his policies.
So you have this perfect storm of factors that could empower him to carry out his most extreme promises.
It's scary.
It is, but it's important to remember that the American people are not a monolith.
Right.
There will be strong opposition to many of his policies.
And that opposition could grow.
Absolutely. And the courts, despite the conservative tilt, are not a rubber stamp for presidential power.
And the media, despite its flaws,
still plays a crucial role in holding those in power accountable.
We've painted a pretty stark picture.
We have.
Of what a second Trump term could look like.
Yeah, it's not exactly a rosy picture.
Especially on day one.
Especially on day one.
But let's step back for a second and consider the bigger picture.
Okay.
What are some possible scenarios for the next 4 years?
That's the big question.
Yeah. Could it really be as dramatic as some people fear?
It's possible.
Or will the realities of governing temper his ambitions?
Well, that's what we're all hoping for, right?
I mean, on one hand, you could envision a scenario where Trump, emboldened by victory, backed by a supportive Congress, just steamrolls his agenda through, reshaping America in his image.
It's a chilling thought.
And it's not just domestic policy.
Right.
I mean, his America First foreign policy could further strain relations with allies, embolden adversaries like Russia and China.
It could increase the risk of global conflict.
It's a lot.
It is.
Unpredictability.
And disdain for diplomatic norms.
It's already rattled the international order.
It has.
A second turn could amplify that.
Absolutely.
Leading to a more volatile and dangerous world.
It's a scary thought.
So that's the worst case scenario, a sort of Trump unleashed.
Right.
But is there a possibility, however slim, that he might moderate his approach in a second term?
It's not entirely out of the question.
Okay.
History shows that presidents often moderate their stances once they're in office.
Once they have to actually govern.
Right. They face the complexities of governing, the weight of the office, the need to build consensus, the constant scrutiny.
Yeah, they can have a tempering effect.
So maybe he'd focus on areas where he could find common ground with Democrats.
Maybe, like infrastructure.
Trade deals.
Yeah. Issues that could deliver tangible results.
Burnish his legacy.
It's possible.
Or maybe he just prioritizes issues that resonate with his base but are less politically divisive.
Right, like Veterans Affairs.
Economic growth.
Focus on those pocketbook issues.
That appeal to a broader swath of the electorate. It could happen.
But let's be honest. It's hard to imagine Trump completely abandoning his confrontational style.
It is.
And becoming a consensus builder overnight.
It's just not in his DNA.
It's not who he is.
And even if he did try a more moderate approach, he'd likely face resistance from within his own party.
Right. Many Republicans have embraced his hardline stance.
They have.
They'd expect him to deliver on those promises.
The pressure from his own base would be immense.
So it seems like the most likely scenario falls somewhere between those two extremes.
Probably.
He'll probably try to push through as much of his agenda as possible.
Right.
But he'll inevitably face obstacles and setbacks.
Absolutely. Legal challenges, legislative gridlock, public protests.
Global crises.
Yeah, who knows what the next 4 years will bring.
Right.
The question is, how will he react to those challenges?
Will he double down on his divisive tactics?
Or will he find a way to adapt and compromise?
And let's not forget the power of the American people.
Right. They're not passive bystanders in all of this.
They have a voice.
They do, and they can make it heard.
There will be opposition.
There will be.
And that opposition could grow over time.
Force him to recalibrate.
Exactly. That's one of the defining features of American democracy.
It's the capacity for self-correction.
If a president becomes too authoritarian,
too overreaching,
there are mechanisms in place to push back.
The courts, the media, Congress.
And most importantly,
the people themselves.
So while a second Trump term raises legitimate concerns,
it does.
The future isn't predetermined.
No, it's not set in stone.
There's still room for hope.
There is.
For resistance.
For a better path forward.
It all depends on how we as citizens respond to the challenges ahead.
Absolutely. We have a role to play in shaping the future.
So it's vital to stay informed.
To hold our leaders accountable.
And to never give up on the fight for a more just and equitable society.
The stakes are too high to be complacent.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the potential second term of Donald Trump.
It's been a wild ride.
We've explored the promises, the perils, and the possibilities.
We have.
Here's a final thought for you to ponder.
Okay, I'm listening.
If Trump is truly intent on retribution, as he's suggested, could that very focus backfire, consume his presidency,
Interesting.
and ultimately hinder his ability to achieve his broader goals
Food for thought.
as we navigate this uncertain future?
For sure.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll be back soon with more.
Until then, stay engaged, stay informed, and stay hopeful.
Absolutely.
So we've been talking about the people and the promises, right?
Yeah.
But let's dig a little deeper
Okay.
into the possible fallout from these day one actions,
Right.
especially on immigration,
Okay.
which seems to be like his pet issue, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And the idea of mass deportations on a scale like he's talking about is
Pretty alarming.
it's really scary.
Where would all these people even go?
Right.
And what about the economic impact
Yeah.
of removing so many people from the workforce?
That's huge.
It's massive, and it's something that often gets lost in all the heated rhetoric.
Yeah, totally.
I mean, mass deportations would be a logistical nightmare, right?
Right.
You need immense resources. It could
Yeah.
lead to human rights violations.
Right.
And the economic fallout could be devastating,
Yeah.
especially for industries that rely on immigrant labor, like agriculture, construction.
It's mind-boggling to me
It really is.
that there isn't more focus on the practical side of this
Right.
and the ethical implications.
Oh, absolutely.
Uprooting families,
Yeah.
separating parents and children,
Mhm.
sending people back to places they may not even remember.
It's heartbreaking.
And it just feels like his language dehumanizes immigrants.
It does.
It paints them as this threat.
Yeah, this dangerous other.
Extending us the
And then,
breakdown.
instead of individuals with hopes and dreams like everyone else.
So it sounds like these mass deportations are not only impractical,
Right.
but also just morally wrong.
I would agree with that.
But what about his other immigration promises, like ending catch and release
Yeah.
and reviving Remain in Mexico?
Those are more within the realm of presidential authority,
Okay.
but they'd still face legal challenges and logistical hurdles.
Right, because the courts have already kind of slapped him down on some of his immigration policies.
They have.
Remind me what those were again.
So ending catch and release would probably require a massive expansion of detention facilities.
Which are already...
Overcrowded and known for their terrible conditions.
Right.
And then Remain in Mexico.
Yeah.
Forced asylum seekers to wait in Mexico while their cases were processed here,
Right.
exposed them to really dangerous conditions,
Yeah.
limited their access to legal representation.
That's just awful.
Human rights groups condemned it, and there were legal challenges.
Biden ended up rescinding it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it seems like his whole approach to immigration is about, like...
Projecting strength,
Yeah.
appealing to his base,
Right.
even if it means, like, throwing practicality and decency out the window.
Just a show,
It is. It's about sending a message.
even if that message doesn't make sense.
Exactly.
And I think it raises concerns about how he governs in general.
It does.
Because if he's willing to disregard the rules on immigration,
Yeah.
what's to stop him from doing it on other issues?
Like climate change.
Yeah, climate change, education.
Exactly.
So let's talk about those.
Okay.
What could happen if he follows through on his day one promises in these areas?
Well, on climate change, he's been pretty clear
Yeah.
that he wants to undo a lot of what Biden did,
Okay.
rolling back regulations, promoting fossil fuels, maybe even pulling out of the Paris Agreement.
It's like he doesn't believe in climate change at all.
It's a dangerous approach,
Yeah.
and it puts us at odds with most of the world.
Okay, what about education?
Well, his threats to cut funding for schools that teach about race and gender or have mask mandates,
Right.
that's just going to create chaos and division,
Yeah.
and it'll hurt marginalized students the most.
Absolutely.
And his attacks on transgender students they're just awful.
Yeah, trying to ban gender-affirming care.
Right.
Restrict their participation in sports.
It's discriminatory,
It's hard.
based on fear and misinformation.
So it seems like this day one agenda is just like...
A greatest hits of his most divisive policies,
Yeah.
the ones that really fire up his base.
What does this say about how he'd govern in a second term?
I think it suggests he's doubling down on what he did before,
Okay.
appealing to his base,
Right.
stoking fear and anxiety,
Yeah.
undermining democratic institutions.
It's about consolidating his power,
Absolutely.
then silencing anyone who disagrees with him.
It's about power, not unity.
And it feels like he's learned from his first term,
In a way.
because he's focusing more on executive action,
Right.
trying to bypass Congress whenever he can.
He's not waiting for permission anymore.
He's just going for it.
He realized he can get away with a lot.
And that's a worrying sign.
It is.
Because he's clearly frustrated by the limits of our system.
By checks and balances. And that's dangerous.
The whole point of checks and balances is to prevent tyranny.
Right, to prevent any one person from having too much power.
What happens if he dismantles those safeguards?
It could permanently damage our democracy.
And he's got a Republican-controlled Congress backing him up?
Most of them, yeah.
And he's stacked the courts with conservative judges.
Including the Supreme Court.
Who are likely to side with him.
So it's a perfect storm.
It's scary.
It is, but remember, the American people are not a monolith.
Okay.
There will be opposition.
And that opposition could grow.
It could.
And the courts,
Right.
even though they're conservative,
Right.
they're not going to just rubber stamp everything he does.
And the media still has a role to play.
In holding him accountable.
Absolutely.
Right.
Okay, so we've talked about what day one might look like.
Yeah, pretty intense.
And some of the potential consequences down the road.
Right, it's a lot to process.
It is, but let's zoom out a bit.
Okay.
Big picture.
Big picture, all right?
What are some possible scenarios for the whole term?
Yeah, could it really be as dramatic as some fear?
Well, I mean, on the one hand, you could see Trump,
Right.
emboldened by the win with a supportive Congress, basically just steamrolling his agenda through reshaping America, in his vision.
It's a scary thought.
Yeah, and it's not just domestic policy either, right?
No, his foreign policy
America first.
could really strain things with our allies
Oh, yeah, big time.
and embolden countries like Russia and China.
Right, and that could increase the risk of conflict.
It's a lot to think about.
It really is.
That's the worst case scenario, right?
Kind of a Trump unleashed.
But is there any chance he might moderate his approach?
I mean, it's not impossible.
Okay.
Presidents do sometimes moderate their stance once they're actually in office.
Right, they have to deal with reality.
Exactly. The weight of the office, the need to compromise, all that.
So maybe he focuses on stuff he can agree on with Democrats.
Could be, like infrastructure.
Yeah, or trade.
Stuff that gets results, builds his legacy.
Right, or maybe he sticks to his base, but picks less controversial stuff.
Like veterans issues.
Right, pocketbook issues.
Stuff with broader appeal.
But honestly, it's hard to imagine him becoming, like, Mr. Compromise.
It's tough. It's just not really who he is.
Right.
And even if you tried, he might get pushback from his own party.
Right, they've gone all in on his hardline stance.
Exactly. They expect him to deliver.
So it seems like the most likely scenario is somewhere in between.
Probably, yeah.
He'll push his agenda,
Right.
but he'll hit roadblocks.
Legal challenges,
Gridlock.
protests, maybe even some global crisis.
Who knows what could happen?
Right. And the question is, how does he react?
Doubles down.
Or finds a way to adapt?
And we can't forget about the American people.
Right. They're not just going to sit back and watch.
There'll be pushback.
And it could grow.
That's what's great about our system, right?
It is. It's designed to self-correct.
If a president gets too powerful,
The people can push back.
through the courts, the media, Congress. So a second Trump term is definitely worrying,
It is.
but the future's not set in stone.
No, we still have agency.
There's hope, there's room for resistance.
We can shape the future.
It all depends on how we respond to the challenges.
It does. We need to stay informed.
Hold our leaders accountable
Never give up the fight.
for a better world.
Exactly. The stakes are too high to be complacent.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive into Trump's potential second term.
It's been a fascinating, if somewhat unsettling, discussion.
We've covered the promises, the risks, the possibilities.
Hopefully we've given our listeners some food for thought.
One last thing to consider.
Okay.
What if Trump's focus on retribution actually backfires?
Interesting.
Could it consume him and prevent him from achieving anything else?
Now that's a question worth pondering.
Thanks for joining us.
Always a pleasure.
We'll be back soon with more deep dives into the news.
Until then, stay engaged, stay informed,
And most importantly,
stay hopeful.